Welcome to Managing Tensions, Not People. My name's Russ Lewis. I'm the researcher. I'm going to guide you through this presentation today. So imagine a business situation where there's demand for the output of a function, could be an IT function, engineering function. They provide the capability, and especially in a hierarchical organization where each of these different departments have got their own targets. You've got to imagine there are hundreds of tensions here. In most business scenarios, certainly in IT, we hear we want stuff faster, we want more features, and we want to reduce costs as well. And this always reminds me of the original Star Trek, where Scotty would say, she can't take any more, Captain, but somehow magically, they would find the extra power. Spock would magic some dilithium crystals out of, out of space, and they would somehow get through it all, and they'd be there for another episode. And I think it's always the same in organizations, is somehow, you get through it, you find some middle ground. But how does that actually work? I mean, we know that for entertainment, for music and drama, it's good to have that tension and release. That's what keeps audiences interested. But in real life, in the survival of an organization, how does that work? How do you resolve those tensions? And why don't they teach us that at school? And look, I've always thought of myself as a connector. I kind of made a career out of connecting people with concepts, people with techniques, and people with other people. For instance, I designed and built TfL's contactless fares engine back in 2010, and I guess what I was doing there was connecting a payments system, contactless bank cards, with a smart billing system, which obviously we built and designed. But at the same time, I connected managers and developers with agile practices, and that was so effective that that obviously they adopted agile forevermore. And I could see that it worked, so I've connected many other organizations with agile practices and agile ways of thinking. And it's only been lately, and when I say lately, I mean the last couple of weeks, that I've started to see that this work that I do, this connecting, is really helping leaders and managers manage those tensions within their organizations. Now, I mentioned school. I learned whatever I learned at school, mostly how to repair cars and engines and tinker with watches and not repair them. And I went to Rolls-Royce because of that, and I was an apprentice, and I learned workshop skills. But then, there was nothing really. I was very much self-taught or self-learning. I would absorb knowledge from anywhere and everywhere. I would attend talks and listen to people that told stories, and read and study, which I never did at school. But I did all of that, and then I was really keen to try it out, sort of fearless, I think, to try things out. Certainly, that's how I embraced agile and all of these practices. I just tried them. And because I actually got quite good at this, I became a trainer. I was very good at training, and quite inspiring, because I didn't mind making the mistakes in front of people. So I transparently make mistakes and fail. And I think that's what inspired people, is they could see that I could make a mistake and find my way out of it, and they liked that as well. So I learned programming in my last month at Rolls-Royce after I'd completed my apprenticeship, and they put me in the computing department to keep me out of trouble. And they didn't want me messing about with their mainframes, because they were big, expensive machines. And they gave me this box, and it must have been the very first desktop computer. And it came with a little handwritten book by Donald Alcock, and he annotated it with these bugs, which was beautiful. And I think that's why, because the bugs, I still like the bugs, and I even found the book and I copied a bug. I think it's okay to make mistakes, and I think that's been a really good basis for my learning practice. So that's what I'm good at. I'm good at learning and failing publicly. Now you might wonder what any of this has got to do with the topic that you've signed up for. And there's a reason that I'm doing it, and it's a bit of a reminder, is that the academic mindset, the academic way of going about things, is different from the business. So in the academic world, through the academic lens, if you like, the researcher's positionality, their philosophy, their how do they learn, how do they see the world, what is reality, and all of that stuff, that's what matters. The literature that researcher selects, right, that's very subjective. That's what the researcher selects. And even if they're doing a methodological, systematic review of literature, they still engage deeper with stuff that resonates. That's normal for us. And therefore that methodology, the way they approach it, all of these things matter. So within the academic world, it is really the academic, and in my mind, there's this academic system, there's the reality, there's the world out there, and within that you're sort of following. It's a little bit like this. You're following that person, that researcher, because what they say matters. And in business, that's not true at all. In business, there's only three things that matter: the results, the outcomes, and the numbers and the measurements of the results, and the results that dictate what's going to happen next. So from an academic point of view, they would describe me as a pragmatist and a practitioner. I'm a practitioner researcher. But from a business point of view, I'm a coach, I'm an agent of change, I enable change. So there is already these different mindsets, and that's a tension right there. We've got, well, that's our second tension. So you might have noticed in my learning journey, I did a master's degree many years after leaving formal education. So that was my first degree. It was only 5-6 years ago. And while I was researching organizational agility, which is the topic of my master's, I went back through systems thinking and cybernetics, as well as management. And I kind of discovered a lot of things, mostly that agile, well, first of all, agile didn't really feature as such. Agile is a sort of a combination and a product of things that came before. Mostly in this area, mostly what happened after the World War, after the recovery of the World War and wars, and the beginning of this kind of the psychological revolution and behavioural awareness that came out. We started to see as well. You've got Amy Edmondson's psychological safety. So agile itself is really in this area. It's taken learning from here, sort of rejecting these early pioneers. Although the truth is you can't, because, for instance, Henry Ford, or even before Ford, Adam Smith, the pin factory. That's the beginning of mass production. And in fact, he wrote in this book in 1776, he said, yeah, I'm not really sure about my redesign for the pin factory, because although it's going to be far more efficient and we're going to get far more productivity from workers, I think it's going to be a little bit boring for them doing the same tasks over and over again. So he was very much aware of that. And you've also got people here like Deming and Taichi Ono, who are very, very concerned with the feelings of the people doing the work. That really, really mattered to them. And they talked a lot about respect. And then here you've got Henry Mintzberg, who Henry's wonderful. He's still blogging, and so he was the great sort of management researcher. Now all of these people, these are the systems people. They saw the organization as a system. So did these guys here, Maslow and so on, but they started to understand the human dimension much more. So Deming and his crowd, they were aware that psychology mattered, but they didn't really have the tools. And here, as you start to get into the sort of later part of the 20th century, those tools start to emerge. And eventually we get to around, I think around about mid-60s, early 70s, we get complexity science coming out, and the idea that an organization is this complex system of people that adapts. So along comes agile, and with agile is that idea that we're humanizing the workplace. So all of these things come together. And obviously that's where I was interested. But there was nothing that brought together what managers did. Because remember, this is management literature. There's nothing that really brought together management, well, agile for managers, literally 2 or 3 books. And when you think back, what was important at the time to researchers or to organizations, what was important here was, there had been 2 world wars. These had a huge impact. So what was important was to feed people, and to rebuild organizations and countries. So that's what mattered. Here, when we've got the technological revolution that we've seen, in the late 20th century, starting 1980, the big turning point, of course, the 2000, when we start to see the impact of agile ways of working. Here what was important, it was different. It was things like social awareness and justice and communication. And we're just at the beginning of, I think, of that social justice curve. Here we could solve big problems with big machines, right? This was very much the end of the industrial age, the machine, complicated age. We could solve problems with designing big machines. Now over here, and certainly as we move into more recent times, we're starting to understand the complexity, complex individuals within complex organizations, and there are no solutions, there are no machines that we can design that will solve people's problems or satisfy their needs. The only thing that we can do is to do with dialogue. It's learning to listen, learning to be inclusive, to hear everybody, and continually improving. So making things a little bit better all the time. And that's really where we are. And that's difficult because that's genuinely complex and uncertain. So I knew that managers were the experts of their organization. They'd been there a while, they understood, they formed the culture. Agile had done a great deal for software development for engineers, but done really very little for managers. It never pretended to speak to managers. So what I wanted to find out, and I couldn't find out for my master's, is what could we do that would talk to managers? And Deming used to ask this wonderful question whenever he heard, yes, we must do this. His reply was, by what method? How are you going to do it? So how do you agilize, or how do you humanize the workplace and make it more agile? Well, I failed to find the answers for that in 2017 when I did my literature review. But now I'm doing my doctoral research, I think I have an answer, well, at least a suggestion. And it's called the ambidextrous organization. You'll notice on all of these slides, whenever I'm referencing a paper, the reference is down the bottom, and of course you'll be able to get that when you see the slides. So the ambidextrous organization really was really made popular through this article in 1996. So very similar timeline development actually to Agile. And the term was first coined in 1979 in a conference proceedings, a chapter in a book in a conference proceedings. Slightly political, the prevailing university powers that be didn't really like it because it was a bit practical, it was a bit empirical, and they really rather preferred their ivory towers. So I can't find the actual book chapter, but I found reviews about it, and they were a little bit condescending. Anyway, that book chapter uses the term ambidextrous organization, and it's used to describe the dual structures that exist in many firms, whereby you have a separate department for doing separate things. skunk works at Microsoft was certainly one way of doing it, but even just separating R&D from operations. That was picked up in 1996 by Tushman and O'Reilly, and they wrote this great article which was really about how organizations had to do quite radical revolutionary change as well as evolutionary change. So they had to do both things, but it was very difficult to do revolutionary change because, frankly, managers, because it's managers that will do this, managers are stuck with the inertia that's given them success. So you don't really want to do it. Very, very hard to do. So you can recognize that there are new technologies, you can recognize that there are better practices, and I think we see that today. You might be able to argue that people don't know how to change, and maybe that's true, but also are they willing to change? So I've never seen this in an academic paper before. I guess it's more of a business journal, California Business Review, California Management Review, excuse me. But they ended with this quote from Machiavelli, The Prince, or the book is called The Prince, which is, this 16th century guide to the immoral behavior required of monarchs and rulers. You don't have to read it, because what it says is you're going to introduce change in your organization and it's going to make you unpopular, right? But Tushman and O'Reilly are saying, tough, you have to introduce change and be unpopular. Otherwise, your organization is not going to survive. Now, in the article, they reference tons of organizations, and looking back on them, 30 odd years later, some of them are quite funny. You've got examples of good being British Airways. Well, they had done a turnaround, and it was a cultural one, and it was successful at the time. But they also talk about RCA, who used to make valves, which obviously got wiped out by the technological change that was the transistor industry. So there's a lot of stuff in the article, but basically what they came up with was this idea that ambidexterity, the ability to do revolutionary and evolutionary change, was necessary, and the formula for doing it was this. Now, this is actually interesting because we'll recognize some of these things. The first is managers must promote variation. So the opposite of one size fits all, the opposite of the alignment and the efficiency that comes with removing the variation. So think about Henry Ford's mass production. Everything's the same color, everything's the same, because that's faster and more effective. And managers understand that if they can do that, makes managing simpler to do, makes the job of managing simpler. And what Tushman and O'Reilly said is, no, you need the variation. Now for them, don't forget, ambidexterity was a structural thing. It meant you have different departments doing different things. So what they were really saying is, you let your different departments do different things, but you bring them together with a kind of an overriding culture or strategy or something that says, but this is what we really do as an organization. And that itself should be driven by what the market wants, not what your strategy department says. And then in the middle, you've got this is autonomy, really. You have to give these business units, you have to give them the autonomy to get close enough to their customers and make decisions that are different from each other. All right? Well, these are very modern ideas, really. And somehow, a book that came out previous to that, 1991, March the name, not March the month, these are the terms that stuck, and I mean, the terms bother me, but it's exploring and exploiting. But it was exploiting and exploring in knowledge. It was organizational learning. And the point that March made was that if what your business unit, if what your department is doing is exploiting, taking advantage of the resources that your organization has invested in and built, so machinery and so on, and knowledge, then you're going to have structurally operations departments. You're going to run the business type of activities, and you're going to focus on things like increasing efficiency by reducing variation, by making sure everybody aligns to the same, we're all going to do this. And then obviously reducing costs. So if you recognize any of these, right, these are out of the playbook of just forgive the word for a second, of exploiting the resources that we already have. And you might even know that in those sorts of cultures, if you've ever worked in them, people are often called resources as well. On the other hand, much more of an R&D type of style is the skills that you've learned, that the business units have learned, are exploring and innovating. They've learned learning, a bit like I did through my career. I'm actually very good at change. I'm really rotten at staying with the same thing and exploiting that. So what are the measures that are going to matter here? Well, obviously, if you're developing new ideas and new technologies and you measure that through the number of patents or the number of new products that you launch or the number of, I remember 3M had a metric that said 50% of your revenue has to come from products that you've brought to market within the last 5 years. So these are the measures that are going to matter in these areas, in these departments. So, you know, we've got these, or this is my lens really, I'm putting this lens on it that different leanings are going to lead to different measures, and as we know, measures are always going to drive behaviors. And leaning is what brings us to what happened in the 1950s as Japan rebuilt its industrial economy. And there's an important paper in the Ambidexterity literature, Adler et al., 1999. That was the paper that said, well, wait a minute, this doesn't have to be structural at all, because, you know, we visited a Toyota GM plant, and what we've seen is we've seen that they can be both efficient. It's Toyota, right? So they're very, very focused on efficiency, but also flexible. Now, they measured flexible with non-routine tasks. In particular, this is Toyota, so they're making parts for cars. In particular, the dies that press the panels, big steel panels, huge 1,000-ton presses. And, you know, you might make 100 panels, 100 of one panel, and then you want to change that die, that press, to make a different panel. Now, how long it takes to change that die in the press is going to dictate how long that press is down for. Now, that's they call that a non-routine task. So what they wanted to do was, or what they did, excuse me, what the researchers found is that the workers worked on creating ways to make these non-routines easier. And that was part of their job. That was understood, that was what they did. Time was given to do that, and that was an improvement that was measured and monitored. And everything of course was done in full collaboration with managers, right? So at this plant, Toyota plant, they showed ambidexterity, in this case, of efficiency and flexibility. And they showed that it could be done just by the same people in the same place. And I think there are other examples of that as well. For instance, for me, DevOps is it's a practice whereby you say, I'm going to take a development team and I'm going to take an operations team and I'm going to make them one structural team, right? And that produces ambidexterity. We know the results are, you know, 5,000 times better performance than non-DevOps teams. Lean, most of the things that we do around lean, all of the improvements, how can we improve flow? A lot of that comes through exactly the same thing, is we dedicate time and therefore management focused on improving the process and improving the work. All right. So in other words, lean was doing this in the 50s, and this is what Taiichi Ohno wrote about. In fact, he and Shigeo Shingo they wrote about this die-changing activities in when they were describing the Toyota production system, and it was very deliberate. And in fact, they got they got the press change around time down from 4 hours down to single-digit minutes, right? Just by focusing on this. And of course, in Agile, we take a lot from Lean. In 2004, Julian Birkinshaw and Christina Gibson showed the relationship between ambidexterity and context. Some people will think of this as culture. It's slightly more than just culture. And what they managed to trace, and they did this quantitatively, so there are numbers involved because obviously that is considered more desirable for business surveys. They interviewed more than 4,000 individuals across 10 global firms, so big firms, and they showed that the way that people were managed and supported, so this is a little bit back to autonomy, mastery and purpose, so those type of contextual things set very much by managers, that is what, so these things here, that is what predicted, so in other words, they found a correlation between that, the context, and ambidexterity. Now, ambidexterity here was whether they could simultaneously be aligned to a single goal and adaptable. In other words, they're aligned to a goal, but they're also adaptable in what they can do. So they can, you've got best of both worlds. That's ambidexterity. Doing them simultaneously, and increasing that factor was a predictor of business unit performance. Whatever that business unit did performed better if they were ambidextrous, and they were more ambidextrous if the context created by the managers was better. Okay, so a quote from that paper: encouraging a supportive organizational context that generates simultaneous capacities for alignment and adaptability may be a key source of competitive advantage, right? Get that right, you get that, you get performance here, you get results here, and you're going to get results here. So that was quite an important paper, because now we proved that we don't need to put people in separate structures. We can get them together and work together. So we're even showing, in a way, this is showing the collaborative nature. There's another paper that I really like that came out. This one looked at two different dimensions. They looked at the technical innovation, how much technical innovation was going on, as well as how much market innovation. So technical innovation could be you're developing a new product, and market innovation means that you're delivering that new product into a new market. Now, that condition that I've just described is this top left-hand corner, and they found that these are the factors, these are contextual factors that business units that were developing new products and creating new markets, that was what they found. So the managerial oversight, flexible. The culture was external, they were looking outside, they were allowed to choose their own goals, and they were differentiated, they were structurally different. Okay. Now, in fact, the two business units that stood out there were making nutrition bars and coffee products. Whereas down here, the focus was also external, so they were still doing technical innovation. However, they had what they politely called stable management oversight. In other words, they were closely supervised, and they were supervised to meet these output control. They were handed goals rather than being autonomous. They were also differentiated because this was typically a product development department. And what you've got here is a department that's innovating, technically innovating. They're building new products, but for existing markets. So this is a fantastic paper, and this is, and they actually called it, they called this a revised blueprint of ambidextrous organization because it was bringing together contextual and structural factors. So really interesting paper. So how many tensions have you spotted so far? Right? There's been a lot. There's been quite a lot of them. I was fascinated with that question, and in fact that's what I'm doing at the moment is I'm trying to list those different tensions, and I'm trying to find a really good way to visualize it as well. So that previous paper I got this idea of market versus technical, and knowledge from Marsh, and so I was thinking of that. But in fact the list is huge, and this is a little bit out of date. I've got dozens more of them. And then as I drill down through the literature, and my core literature is 72 papers, and then I've got another 80 to go. I've noticed different tension types. So I've only really been telling you about these: exploration, exploitation. There are also value conflicts. A colleague told me a wonderful story. She's a marine biologist and she was working off the coast of Canada, the salmon farms. And of course, for the Canadian government, salmon farming is a form of income and feeding the population. Whereas for the First Nations there, the salmon is a spiritual being, right? So you've got a value conflict. And there's some more work. Professor Gerald Midgley, done a lot of work in New Zealand with farmers and water and agriculture. So these are deeply seated value conflicts, and in fact what's interesting about that work is finding ways to manage the conflict. The tension there is a conflict, and by discussing it, really by understanding and seeing the other side, they get better solutions that come out. There's also a body of work, there's a literature just around paradoxes. So of course that's very closely aligned. And then you've got the whole idea of philosophical differences. And you might be asking yourself, look, so what? So what? So let me try and answer that for you. Birkinshaw is adamant that ambidexterity is the result of a managerial capability. It happens because managers make it happen, deliberately or accidentally. And he puts it like this: why else do we need managers other than to help organizations do the things that don't come naturally to them? And I think that's really key, because we all tend to do what our strengths tell us to do, and in some ways that creates division and polarization. He also says that, look, ambidexterity is a purely academic construct. It was invented by academics. He actually points fun about people in business that would come up with the word ambidexterity after they've been on a course, right? But I say that what it does is it helps us understand how organizations work, and really that's what managers do need to do. They need to understand how their organization works so they can make it better. I'm also interested in ambidexterity because of the reason that goes back to my master's research. I was gutted that I couldn't find the management inside information on organizational agility, right? That's what I was researching, but there was nothing. There is one book by Aniel Medellina on agile for managers, and David Anderson wrote a couple of, well, certainly one book that he doesn't even like talking about now. I thought it was excellent. And plenty of blog posts on Agile for Managers, but there's not a lot. I've since discovered, and this is only the last couple of years, and some of it is very new as well, I've since discovered that if you want the information on organizational agility or business agility, these are really good places. These are really good places to start. And by start, I mean you start with these papers and you'll see the whole field. Anything, by the way, in academia, anything that says reflection and research agenda, something like that, that means they're going back and looking at all the literature. So they're great entry points because you see a whole panoply. This first article is if this does not win the decade prize for paper, then there is no justice in the world. This is a superb paper. So all of those are good. And if you want any of those, then just ping me and I can send it to you if you can't access them directly. And then there's other bits and pieces. You've got to know, I think that the lens of ambidexterity has allowed me to see things, it helps you find what you're looking for when it's not, certainly you won't find it under agile. So dynamic capabilities is very closely aligned to agility and ambidexterity. And as is paradox is a very useful one. And then my own interest as a professional practitioner, as a coach, as a transformation designer, I suppose, is I'm interested in, and this is a bit mind-blowing really. I think if we say ambidexterity becomes the goal, agility or agile or design thinking or any of those practices, those are ways of achieving that goal. Right? So agile originally resolved the tension between what consumers and customers wanted and what developers were able to produce. So it closed that gap, right, between customer and developers. In the same way, DevOps closed the gap. It's a method of closing the gap, bridging the tension, resolving the tension between change and run. So if we think of ambidexterity as a goal, and we've now got the evidence that shows that performance increases with ambidexterity, so ambidexterity in whatever form it is, whether it's in learning or in change or whatever, is a good thing. If we make it the goal, we can now start to identify the tensions. And some of those tensions might be conflicts. They can be nasty, right? But mostly they're just tensions. And sometimes they're not spoken about, so we identify them. We say, look, let's spot this difference and let's learn to manage, let's become effective across these tensions. And that not all of them are dualistic, but dualism, this kind of black and white thing, makes it much easier for us to engage with it. Complexity is too hard. But if we go, oh yeah, it's black or white, why don't we have some kind of grey? Right? Our brains can cope with that. So we can improve our effectiveness across the tensions, so identify the tensions, negotiate, manage, and then improve our performance. And what's interesting about that is instead of the tension being a constant fight over budgets, there is a fixed budget and we're only going to get this, one wins, one loses. Instead of that, we go to an outcome that both sides essentially want, right? And everybody wins because the whole organization improves as a consequence. And don't forget as well that my mission in life, my professional mission in life is this, it's improving organizations with managers. And I think ambidexterity can help us do that. And I think we do it by what method? By identifying and managing tensions, not people. So that's it. There's some details if you want to contact me. And that's it. 40 minutes is up. Thank you very much.